let's talk about Taxi Driver, the film that put Martin Scorsese on the map for most people, and to this day it's still considered one of his finest works. There's plenty of things to talk about in this film, from the incredible directing of Scorsese, which manages to capture the smoke and garbage-filled neon streets of the 1970s New York that the film is set in, which alongside the jazzy score really makes for a film that feels truly unique. One of my favorite things about the film is how it was one of the first ones to put a character's mental state and his deteriorating mental health front and center, which nowadays is pretty commonplace in films, but back then it was unheard of. Travis Bickle is truly a character that someone who is experiencing loneliness can relate to, which is due in no small part to Robert De Niro's performance. Recently, several themes and the aesthetic of Taxi Driver were used to inspire Todd Phillips' Joker, which, though many critics use it against the film, I actually think it helps out the film a lot. But it's hard for me to say something that hasn't already been said. Besides, I have a better story to tell you this time. But for that, we need to go back to the early 2000s, when video games kept getting closer to movies, for better or for worse. Now, when done right, it managed to let you relive your favorite moments from the film in ways that were previously unachievable. Games like Star Wars Battlefront and Spider-Man 2 were examples of a perfect marriage of film and video games. However, these were the exception, not the rule. Most video game tie-ins were usually a cash grab that tried to leech off the success of a film, but within all these tie-in movie games, a weird subgenre was born. You see, most tie-ins were usually made to coincide with a film's release, but it was only a matter of time before some asshole executive realized that this wasn't the case and instead say, hey, why don't we just take classic movies that everybody loves and make video games about them? And seeing how plenty of games like Mafia and especially Grand Theft Auto were heavily inspired by films like The Godfather and Scarface respectively, it only made sense to these executives to make games based on films that they had already the rights to. So they took the films that everybody loved from the 70s and 80s and made video games about them. There were games based on films like Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, both Part 1 and Part 2, Steven Spielberg's Jaws, Brian De Palma's Scarface, and even Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs all had a video game adaptation of some kind. Now, that's not to say that all of these video games were bad, some of them were actually alright. Even to this day, video games like Alien Isolation prove that you can make a good video game based on a movie that actually respects the original film and it expands upon it. Most of them, however, were usually a quick cash grab by a video game studio that didn't really care about the property and just wanted to make a quick buck leeching off the success of said movie. And you can see why some of these were made. A Scarface video game made perfect sense with the success of Vice City, while others, however, seem kind of odd, like The Godfather and Reservoir Dogs. These aren't films that really have a lot of action, as they're usually quite dramatic, with the action sequences being rather brief and quite gruesome, in sharp contrast to what video games at the time were doing, which was pretty much copying the basis of Grand Theft Auto and making an action-based open-world game. But even with examples like The Godfather and Reservoir Dogs, you could at least kind of make some argument that you could make a game based out of this, given the crime element in both of these movies. However, the same cannot be said for Taxi Driver, because Taxi Driver is more of an existential thriller. It's set in the mind of a Vietnam War veteran that roams the streets of a morally bankrupt New York that is rife with crime and degeneracy on every corner. You can't exactly make a video game about all these serious issues, especially considering that there is only one action sequence in all of the movie and it comes at the very end of the film. It's like making a film based on Apocalypse Now. Sure, you have the setting of a war, but it's not really about that, it's more about the loss of sanity. So making a video game adaptation of a Scorsese classic would have been very difficult, but not impossible. I mean, after all, Rockstar Games had proven that it's more than possible to make a video game based on a 1970s thriller that has minimal action with their adaptation of the film The Warriors. So it was a daunting task even for a talented developer like Rockstar. So who is it that they hired to make a video game adaptation for Taxi Driver? Well, the game was going to be developed by Papaya Studios and published by Majesco Entertainment. If you don't know who either of those video game companies are, then don't worry, I don't blame you. Neither did I. The developer, Papaya Studio, mostly made shovelware mediocre titles based on films and TV shows, especially from Disney properties. Meanwhile, publishers Majesco Entertainment also had a similar list of pathetic non-achievements, but there were some exceptions. They were the publishers behind the Blood Rain series and even published the acclaimed cult classic Psychonauts made by former LucasArts alumni Tim Schafer. They were also responsible for one of the previously mentioned games based on a classic movie, Jaws Unleashed. I guess they just couldn't stop making mediocre tie-ins to beloved movies. So Taxi Driver the game was first shown at E3 2005, even using quotes from the film to further drive the point home that this was indeed real. And just by looking at the footage, you can clearly tell that this is indeed a GTA clone, especially taking inspiration from the series' first outing into 3D, Grand Theft Auto 3, with Robert De Niro's character Travis Bickle gunning down people left and right, and even making some finishing moves that were clearly inspired by the film's climactic battle against the pimps. And the video game wise, this could have been inspired by The Punisher, which had come out the previous year and also had a similar mechanic for executions. Now, at this point you might be asking, why is Travis Bickle killing all of these people? I mean, he barely killed anyone in the movie, and when he did it to save Jodie Foster's character. Well, the main reason is that the game would have been a sort of sequel, yes, just like the Scarface game, even though that one was more of a what-if scenario, but in this one it was literally going to continue the story. And while we don't know the full plot of the game, we do know some key details. The main one is that it would have been a revenge plot, in which after some gangsters murder Betsy, that's the woman that Travis tries to court in the movie, Travis goes full-on vigilante and, in the words of the film, he wants to become the rain that will wash off the filth from the streets. You would have been able to drive your taxi around in an open-world version of New York, collected fares while you weren't doing missions, and this game was basically a weird combination between GTA 3, Crazy Taxi, and, well, Taxi Driver. Now that's a strange mix, but hey, maybe it could have worked. A few game journalists got the chance to play an early build of the game, and they describe it as GTA but without a wanted system. But then, if it doesn't have a wanted system, then how can the game stop you from slaughtering civilians left and right? Well, it's pretty simple actually. As one game journalist who got their hands on the game said, Taxi Driver isn't Grand Theft Auto with De Niro. Travis isn't a villain. He isn't looking to kill innocents. He's a delusional man who believes he's the rain that's going to wash the streets. You can run over innocents or pop them in the face with a shotgun, but the more you kill, the greater the strain on Travis. The screen blurs until Travis passes out, and then you're forced back to your last checkpoint. I'm guessing this was their attempt at staying somewhat close to the source material, kind of. The game apparently had about 10 missions, which, for a PS2 game, seems disappointing, embarrassing even, but it would have supplemented this by making you take fares and becoming, well, a taxi driver. And they tried to be a bit clever with this, as one of the game journalists explains, you have the option to pick up fares while cabbing it around. Just stop near a fare, whoever is standing on the curb waving their arm, and take them to a destination marked on the minimap. Some fares are quite unique. I picked up a woman who wanted to be taken to an office building. Her goal, unbeknownst to me, was to shoot up her former employers. Had I made it to the office, she would have hopped out with gun in hand. I could then chase after her and kill her to stop her from the violence. However, I kicked her out of the cab early, purely by accident, and she shot up the cab in retaliation, which is actually some pretty cool AI scripting. You could see this as another attempt to sort of connect with the film, as there was a similar scene in the film where Travis Bickle takes a guy, played by Martin Scorsese no less, where he drops the gamer word,
but you know who lives there? Lives there.
And tells Travis that he's going to kill his wife who's cheating on him, and the scene ends before we know if the guy actually did it, or if Travis tried to stop him. Another thing that the game journalists said that the game did really well was recreate the grittiness of the 1970s New York, and yeah, I can kind of see that. It does seem that they at least got the visuals down, but in everywhere else? I mean, it looks like a fine action third-person shooter, but I think that's the main problem with this. A Taxi Driver video game? Did this really need to happen? I think that Hillary Goldstein from IGN sums up my thoughts perfectly. Taxi Driver plays fine, has open environments and plenty of bad guys to kill, but it's Taxi Driver, the game. If you're one of those clamoring for more Bickle adventures, Majesco has the makings of a decent title. It just seems like a bizarre licensing decision. You talking to me? Nope, I'm out. Yep, couldn't have said it better myself, Hillary. That's the biggest problem with this video game. It seems to me that the people who wanted to make this video game watched Taxi Driver and just didn't get it, because Taxi Driver isn't about Travis becoming a vigilante. It was about depression, loneliness, and mental deterioration. At the end of the day, Travis Bickle was just a guy, a lonely guy, with a somewhat misguided sense of justice and doing the right thing. You could say that he was a mentally ill loner in a society that treated him like trash. Yeah, that sounds about right. He wasn't the Punisher, he wasn't Max Payne, and he wasn't John Wick. He was Travis Bickle. So turning him into a vigilante gunning down gangsters left and right just doesn't seem right. Now with all of that said, what happened? Why did this game never came out? Well, the official version states that Majesco ran into some problems and had to cancel the game, despite the game being planned for a 2006 release, likely to tie in with the film's 30th anniversary. That same year, Majesco reported a loss of over $70 million, so they had to cancel a few games, among them Taxi Driver, which makes sense, and hey, that's the official version, so that's that, right? Well, there is one additional part of this story that most people don't know, and I think you're gonna enjoy it. First, let's wind back a bit to 2004. Now, during these times, director Martin Scorsese, writer Paul Schrader, and Robert De Niro himself got together to discuss the possibility of a Taxi Driver sequel centering on an older Travis Bickle. However, this went nowhere. Years later, Schrader will admit that they did make a first draft, but that both he and Scorsese thought it wasn't very good. Now, around the same time that they were working on this, they were informed that Sony was going to make a total entertainment experience, which is a very elaborate way of saying a video game. Naturally, the moment that Schrader and Scorsese heard about this, they scrambled to stop it from being made. But a clause in their contract said that in order to get the film made, they sold the rights to all media known and unknown now and in the future, which meant that legally there was nothing they could do. So that's it, right? Well, Paul Schrader certainly thought so. He was like, well, we tried, but for Martin Scorsese, this was far from over. Before we continue, let me introduce you to Dan Kitchen. He's pretty much a video game industry legend, with him beginning to develop way back for the Atari 2600, and he still continues to develop games to this day. Also, he has developed tons of licensed video games. In fact, if you've ever played a video game based on a licensed property, chances are that he worked on it. But anyways, he also worked on this game, and he tells a pretty interesting story. He says that they paid $250,000 for the Taxi Driver license and $1.5 million to the developers, Papaya Studios, to work on the game up front. Then suddenly, they get the call one day from Sony, who owns the Taxi Driver license and who told them that they couldn't continue development on the game anymore. When he asked what the issue was, they said, "Marty doesn't want you to make the game." To which Dan replied, "Marty who? Wait, you mean Martin Scorsese? Holy shit." He obviously reminded them that they had already spent over $1.5 million in the game and that it was 75% done. And then, in Dan's own words, he said, "Martin Scorsese said, if you go ahead with the Taxi Driver game, I'll make sure you never license another fucking movie again." And according to Dan, they cancelled it right then and there, because most of Majesco's video games were based off licensed properties. Wow. It seems that a legally binding contract would stop most directors, but most directors aren't Martin fucking Scorsese. With the snare and the bass, swear in the face, this fucking world better prepare to get laced because they're gonna taste my I got that. It seems that long before he had a feud with Marvel movies and superhero movies in general, he had a bone to pick with video games. And I know he doesn't like Marvel movies, but he pretty much pulled a Thanos in that he basically snapped his fingers and the game just vanished. Damn, that's a pretty gangster move. I guess that you can't make that many gangster movies without learning a few gangster tricks yourself. And to add further insult to injury, Dan said that he spent almost 6 months in order to get Robert De Niro to reprise his role as Travis Bickle. It's funny how Robert De Niro basically would say yes to anything as long as he got paid, while Scorsese was having none of it. Professionals have standards. And again, it's kinda hard to blame Scorsese. You can't just take a cinematic work with so much weight and gravitas and just turn it into a video game. I mean, you can, but why would you? I'm guessing this was the equivalent of telling Martin Scorsese to go home and get his fucking shine box.
Now go home and get your fucking shine box.
Motherfucking mutt! You fucking piece of shit!
Now, it could also be true that the game was in fact cancelled due to Majesco's financial problems, but I like to think that Martin Scorsese's gangster move was what cancelled it. Maybe it was both? But part of me does also kind of wishes that Majesco would have called Scorsese on his bluff and released the game anyway. I can only imagine what could have happened. Marty was cutting every link between himself and the video game, but it had nothing to do with me. I knew Marty. He had Taxi Driver. It was his. Made him sick somebody would make a game without his permission, he'd rather whack him. Anyways, what did I care? I wasn't asking for anything, and besides, Marty was working on a great film called The Departed. Still, months after the game's release, they were finding bodies all over. When they found Dan Kitchen in the meat truck, he was frozen so stiff it took them 2 days to thaw him out for the autopsy. Who knows, maybe that's what could have happened. I guess you could say that Scorsese shot the Taxi Driver game in the face so that Majesco could have given an open coffin at the funeral.
That's that.
Regardless, the game was cancelled in late 2005. In 2006, Papaya Studios sued Majesco for breach of contract because they weren't going to be paid the full amount. So they went to court and, surprisingly enough, Papaya ended up winning a cash settlement and the transfer of the game assets. Huh. If I had a nickel for every time that I made a video where a video game developer has the opportunity to sue its publisher for breach of contract, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Well, so that's the story of the cancelled Taxi Driver game. Nowadays, video games based on movies are going the way of the dodo. While the 2000s were full of video games based on movies, starting with the PS3 and Xbox 360 era, they began to disappear and become more and more rare. In the PS4 and Xbox One era, you'd be lucky to find one video game adaptation, and in this current generation, I haven't heard a single one. I'm guessing that with video games becoming more complex and requiring bigger budgets, film studios no longer see a return on investment on a tie-in video game. Video games like these are no longer financially viable, and it's probably for the best. It didn't matter for studios like Majesco. When they were broke, they just went out and got some more movie licenses. They ran everything. They paid off movie studios, they paid off game magazines, they paid off directors. Everybody had their hands out and everything was for the taking. And now it's all over. And that's the hardest part. Today, everything is different. There is no action. I have to wait around like everyone else. You can't even get a decent tie-in video game. Right after I got here, I ordered some video game adaptation of Dune, and all I got was a Fortnite skin. Now, Majesco gets to live the rest of its life like an average nobody, like a schnook.